everyone, and welcome. I'm Ashley Hasty, the blogger behind HastyBooklist.com, and today I'm here with Nicola Harrison, author of The Showgirl. So Nicola, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So for those viewers who aren't familiar with my blog, I have a series of author interviews, which includes some this or that questions, first thing that comes to mind sort of thing. So I'm going to start this interview with a few questions that I asked Nicola last year for our Q&A for my blog. These are just, like I said, get to know you questions before we dive into the book. Okay, so first, author you draw inspiration from?
F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Favorite place to read a book?
At the beach.
Book character you'd be best friends with?
I would say Dolly from my book Montauk. I loved writing her. I want to be best friends with her.
When it comes to writing, do you prefer pen and paper or computer?
Computer.
What is your favorite decade in fashion history?
The 1920s.
And place you'd most like to travel?
I really want to go to India.
Ooh, that would be fun. So for those viewers who have not yet read the book, let's start off with your synopsis of the book's plot.
Yeah. So The Showgirl takes place at the tail end of the Roaring 20s. Our protagonist from the Midwest, when she meets the infamous Florenz Ziegfeld, the showman and Broadway producer, she sets her sights on New York City and is determined to become one of his showgirls for his glamorous shows, the Ziegfeld Follies. And she does just that, and she doesn't let anything or anyone, get in her way. But then she meets Archibald Carmichael, Archie, as he's known, and he's the first man that she's ever met who accepts her for her modern ways, her independent nature, and her passion for success. But she has a scandalous secret from her past, and she has to ultimately decide if she's willing to reveal this devastating secret. And, she has to choose between the life she loves and the man she loves.
There are so many stories to tell, and I'm always interested in hearing how authors settle on a particular story. So what inspired you to write The Showgirl?
It's funny. I actually, when I started to write my second novel, I had no idea that I was going to be writing about a showgirl. Actually, I had been writing an article for a travel magazine about this resort in the Adirondacks in upstate New York, and it's called The Point. And it's this luxury place where you can go and stay. It's in the woods. And during the research of writing this article, I realized that it was originally built for William Avery Rockefeller II as his family summer compound. And they would go up there and go hiking and boating and spend the summers up there in sort of rustic, extreme luxury. And then I realized that there were all these other places up there that were built at the turn of the century by these wealthy industrialists, and they're all called the Great Camps. And I thought, this is really fascinating. I've never even heard of these places. I'm going to set a story up at one of these great camps. But of course, I'd never even been to the Adirondacks, let alone one of these great camps. So my husband and my son and my dogs and I drove up there, and we went to stay at one of these places, not the one I wrote about, another one called White Pines Camp. And so the next day I was getting a tour by the local historian, and he was telling me all about the architecture and how there's all these, cabins and a great room and a boathouse, and it was all interesting stuff. And then he just casually mentioned that the original owner of this place was once married to a showgirl, a Ziegfeld Folly. And he said she was a real party girl. And she used to invite all of her friends, all of her theater friends and bohemian friends from the village up to their camp in the Adirondacks. And I was like, wait a second, can you tell me more about her? Never mind the architecture and everything. She sounds like a riot. And she used to insist that nobody needed to walk more than 500 feet without having a drink in their hand. So she set up bar carts and bartenders along the hiking trails. And I was like, that's my character. So it sort of took off from there, but it was a roundabout way of getting there.
Linda Ligman, another author I've interviewed for this series, said, Harrison has created a heroine so complex and endearing, so utterly fearless and full of life, that readers will not be able to forget her. The Showgirl is a story as intricate and dazzling as one of Ziegfeld's legendary reviews. So not only was I not able to forget Olive, I was convinced she must be real. So I started Googling her. I found out that she wasn't a real person, but it does sound like she was based on someone you found in your research. Were any
Yeah.
other qualities of hers based on that woman you read or you heard about in that tour?
So it was really just that spark at the beginning. I did do the same as you, and I went and did some research. I found a few little bits and pieces about her, but there wasn't really much to go on. So the rest of the story is all fictionalized, although her name was Olive and his name was Archie. So that stayed, but then the rest is fictionalized and based on research from, the Ziegfeld Follies and everything.
So historical fiction, whether based on a real person or not, requires extensive research. I want to hear a little bit about what your research process looks like.
Yeah. So, well, it started with that trip, and then we went back for another trip. I actually planned our family vacation around it. We went up for the following summer, so we could see what it was like staying at one of these camps. But really, I just read a ton of books on New York City in the 1920s and the Ziegfeld Follies. And I just, one of the books that was really instrumental to me was a memoir written by Doris Eaton Travis. And she, at 14 years old, she was the youngest girl ever to be in one of the Ziegfeld Follies. And she went on to live to be 106. And on her 100th birthday, she went back to the New Amsterdam Theater and she performed.
I would like to dance the same dance routine that I danced on this very stage, 79 years ago. Can you play Mandy?
And she led a conga line of 24 dancers. And so she writes all about her experiences and her theatrical family. Like one of her sisters was also a Ziegfeld Follies girl, and so that was a great resource. And then another book called The Ziegfeld Touch really talked all about Florence Ziegfeld and the shows, and it had pictures of all the stage design and the costumes and the girls on stage, and it detailed every single number that was sang at each show. So it was like amazing. It was like a treasure chest right there. So just, tons of reading books and going to the library and all that fun stuff.
How do you know when you've done enough research to suffice the story, but not so much that you get lost into the rabbit hole and never actually sit down and write the book?
I think it's when you're sort of itching to go. You're like, okay, I just want to start writing. And so then I don't know, that's sort of what, just a feeling you get. And then of course you have to keep researching along the way. There's other things that are going to come up that you haven't researched yet, and you'll delve back into that. But I think it's just a sense when you're itching to go.
Your first novel, Montauk, was set in the late 1930s, and The Showgirl, of course, is set in the 1920s. You already said your favorite decade in fashion history was the 1920s, but do you have a favorite time period as a whole to write about?
I'm sort of like a love the one you're with. So I really love the 20s. I really loved writing about it. It's just such a interesting time, right after World War I, everyone was sort of wanting to break away from the doom and gloom of the war, and sort of all the young people were like itching to break away from the morals of their parents and sort of their old-fashioned ways. And so and women had just got the right to vote, so they were all emboldened by that, and they wanted to live life their way and dress the way they wanted to, and dance the way they wanted to, and smoke and drink, and it was just like a really fun time to see women really fighting to live the way they wanted to live.
Absolutely. Does your background as a fashion journalist help you in any way to write about your characters and their clothing?
I think it does. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm very observant. So I feel like I'm very aware of it all, of what they're wearing, and I probably wouldn't be able to write them well if I didn't have that background. But I'm talking to the pro here. I mean, you're a fashion historian, so I should have had you read this book first. But yeah, I think that my background in fashion helps me sort of bring it to life.
At the beginning of this interview, I asked a bit about your reading habits, but I also want to talk about your writing process. When did you first realize that you wanted to write fiction? Because you do have a background in journalism as well.
Yeah. So I was always writing. I was always like in school. I mean, I went to UCLA and I studied English and creative writing. And then I moved to New York and got into fashion journalism. But I'd always be taking a creative writing class at night, and it was just a passion or a hobby that I had. And then I went back to school and I got my MFA in creative writing. But even then, I was writing more nonfiction. And I don't know. I took the leap when I started writing Montauk, and I didn't know that I would start writing historical fiction. In fact, when I started writing Montauk, it was going to be a story that was set in the present day, but I kept wanting to go back and tell the story of the girl's grandmother. And I thought, if I want to do that, I should just go back and write the story of that took place then. And I've always loved historical fiction. I've always loved, Beatrice Williams and Fiona Davis and all of those great writers. So I just, I took the leap with Montauk.
What do you think was the most difficult part from transitioning from nonfiction to fiction? There's something that didn't click as easily as everything else.
I think I was just kind of scared to do it. I didn't know if I had the right somehow to write fiction and to make stuff up. But I think what I realized along the way is that a lot of it is, yes, it's set in a different time period. And yes, that's new to me. So I have to research that and everything. But even when I'm writing about a woman in the 20s, she still has the same universal needs as the characters that we read about today, or even that we have today. People still want to love and be loved, and they want to feel successful at something. And, all of those themes are the same then as they were now, just slightly, in a different package. So I like to write about things that are in a very different time, but where people can still relate to the characters' desires and wants.
Do you have a favorite place to write?
Anywhere that I get a little peace and quiet away from my kids. I mean, I love writing here in my office, but sometimes they're here and they don't leave me alone if I'm here. So I have to go somewhere. So anywhere where there's a door that closes.
That's fair. That's fair. What does your work schedule look like when you're writing? What does a typical writing day look like?
So in normal times when the kids are in school, I mean, I also have a toddler, so he's just about to start preschool, so it's going to be really good. But ideally, kids go off to school and then I write while they're at school. And that's pretty perfect. That's a pretty perfect schedule. I mean, I feel like I couldn't write, 8 hours a day straight anyway, because I'd go crazy. So, stopping at around 3:00 is the perfect time. But yeah, just having some peace and quiet it gets words on the page.
Authors often describe themselves as either plotters or pantsers, meaning that they write by the seat of their pants. Do you fit one of those categories, or do you see yourself somewhere in between?
Well, I see myself as somewhere in between. And so with both Montauk and The Showgirl, I knew where they were going to start. I kind of had an idea of where it was going to go in the middle, and I had an idea of where it would end. And then I just kind of started writing, and it is true. I mean, it sounds cheesy, but the characters do kind of take on a life of their own, and sometimes they're going places or meeting people, and you're like, I didn't know that character was going to come into this story, or I didn't, and it does take on a life of its own. However, I think I'm changing my ways. For my next book that I'm working on, I'm plotting it out a little more. And so I'm trying that out. We'll see.
Well, that was my next question, actually. Has your process changed between writing and publishing your first novel versus this one? But it sounds like most change is coming with your third.
Yeah. So the first and second were about the same. And I don't know, I know I'll get to the same point, but I'm like, maybe it would make my life a little easier if I do plot it out a little more and sort of know what's coming in each chapter. So I'm trying it.
What do you hope readers gain from reading The Showgirl?
Well, I think a big question that I tried to explore in this novel was sort of, can you have it all? And it's certainly something that I think about a lot for myself, and I think a lot of women think about, can you be a good mother and have a successful career and be a good wife and everything else that you want to be. And that's certainly a struggle that Olive faces in this book, and you know she tries to figure that out. So I think just exploring that and going on that ride is kind of what I want readers to get from it.
So what's next for you? Can you tell us what you're working on for your third
Yeah,
novel?
I can. It might change, so this might be irrelevant as of right now. So the next one takes place in the 1940s, and it's right after World War II. And my protagonist has worked in, her name's Hazel, and she has worked in one of the airplane factories in Southern California during the war. She was a Rosie the Riveter. And then the war comes to an end, all the men are coming home, and she's suddenly out of a job and has to figure out what she's going to do with her life. So she ends up in Laguna Beach, which is an artist community in Southern California. And she ends up working for a famous artist. And he has a pretty shady past. She gets entwined with that. So that's where it's going.
It seems like all three of your novels have focused, or not focused, perhaps is not the right word, but had really strong settings. Montauk, of course, Manhattan, and the camps that you described earlier in The Showgirl, and now your new setting. Is there something particular that you love about these settings that you wanted these books to be here? Or do they happen to evolve just from the characters and story that you're writing?
So I think when I start thinking of an idea to write about, it starts with the place. It definitely starts with the place. I knew I wanted to write a book about Montauk for my first book, and then the story sort of built from there. And it was kind of the same way with this new book that I'm writing. I had just moved. I used to live in California, went to high school and college out here, and then I lived in New York for 17 years, but I just moved back to Southern California. And I thought, I love immersing myself in the world that I'm writing about. So I thought I should write about Southern California. And I lived in Laguna Beach right after college, and I love it. It's such a beautiful town, and there's all this art and culture down there. And so yeah, it definitely starts with a setting for me, and then I start doing research and I build a story from there. That's what it's been so far. Who knows if that process will change with future books.
You're also writing about 3 different time periods. Do you like to look at new time periods to write about, or would you consider writing about a time period that you've already covered in another novel?
I certainly would write about these time periods again. I'd certainly go back to the 20s because I had so much fun with that. But I also like exploring the different time periods. I mean, I've done the 30s, the 20s, and now I'm doing the 40s. The nice thing about writing these books is you do so much research. I mean, so much of the research doesn't even make it into the book, and you become sort of a mini expert on these time periods because you have to know way more than you're actually going to write about just to get a sense of it all. And so it's really fun it's like being back in school, taking history classes. And so I enjoy learning all about the different periods. It's all the things that I should have probably listened to more in school. So who knows, maybe I'll do the 50s next, just work my way up.
I don't oppose that idea. I really like that. And as readers, we get to learn about these time periods as well from all of your research.
Yeah, it's fun.
I want to remind everyone they can purchase copies of The Showgirl from the Novel Neighbor. Nicola, thank you so much for joining me. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much. This was really fun. I loved it. Chapter 1. I saw the marquee first, jutting out onto West 42nd Street, with the bright white letters, Ziegfeld Follies of 1927, all full of light bulbs and ready to illuminate the street when the sun began to fade. The building above the New Amsterdam Theater towered above its neighbors. The names Eddie Cantor, Laura Foster, and the Brock sisters were painted in huge lettering on the side. I allowed myself to imagine for a moment that it was my name up there, big, bold lettering, shouting out for all of New York City to see. During the walk over from Lord and Taylor to the theater, I'd felt quite proud of myself. Mr. Ziegfeld had approached me at a show in California and told me to call on him if ever I was in New York. And look at me now, I thought. Despite everything, I was about to knock on his door, ready to get on that stage. A twinge of nerves flooded through me as I approached the theater entrance, but I shooed them away. Inside was equally impressive. Black and white marble floors, elaborate carved wooden friezes, illustrations of beautiful women adorning the walls. But there was no one in sight. The box office windows were closed. The glass doors to the theater were locked. Looking around, I could see no indication of where to go. So I called the elevator and heard the churning of machinery as it slowly made its way down to the lobby. "Good morning, miss," the elevator attendant said as he opened both doors. "How can I help you?" "I'm here to see Mr. Ziegfeld," I said. "Of course. He's on the 6th floor. Is he expecting you?" "Yes, I believe he is," I said, smirking slightly as I stepped inside. It had been a little over a year since we'd met, and in that time, my life had been turned upside down and back again. But Mr. Ziegfeld didn't know any of that. Surely he was expecting me to show up at some point. In his office, I gave his secretary the same answer I'd given the elevator attendant, because it had worked so well and it tickled me as I said it. His secretary looked through the calendar. "I don't see a meeting scheduled, Miss McCormick." "Really? Are you sure he's expecting you?" "Oh yes," I said, enjoying this more than I should be. "Okay, let me see," she said, getting up and going through a heavy, dark wooden door. When she reappeared, she said, "You can go in now." I quickly walked into the office before anyone had a chance to change their mind, taking a deep breath, willing the confidence to stay with me. The rich burgundy and gold carpet was thick under my feet, as if I were in someone's bedroom, not in their office. Mr. Ziegfeld stood up from his large mahogany desk and walked around to the front to greet me. He looked just as I remembered, slight of build but tall, a full head of silver gray hair, thick black eyebrows, and an impeccably tailored suit. "Hello, Mr. Ziegfeld. So lovely to see you again."